each other, and I'll start Art Weglein at U of H. Richard? Okay, so,
I'm Richard Coates with Western GK.
Hi, I'm Isham Adi from Qatar.
Hi, I'm Maya Rubias from Standard.
Wilbert Herrera from MOSFP.
Scott Hess.
Yi Luo from Aramco.
from Fedon.
Shijun Lee from PGS.
Tongbok Lee from PGS.
Richard Britsky from Devon Energy.
Ron Kerr from Devon.
David Kidd from Montana.
Paul Carvalho, Petrobras.
Christian Rivera from Total.
Bill Dragoset, formerly from Western GECO, now retired.
Really? Any cheers?
Mark Meyer, from Mobile. Glenn Murs, Western GECO.
from MLSRT.
Daniel from MOSFP.
Yi Chang from MOS.
Jin Nong Yang from UH.
Okay, Sarah Brunswick from PGS. Paolo Terengi, formerly MSFP and currently PGS.
Lin Fang from UH. Hong Yang from UH.
Zhechang Wang from UH. Jim Mahan, UH.
Bang Liu Zofat Chama from UH.
again, welcome. Yeah, I think everyone has the agenda. So we're just going to get started. Just for the background stuff. So we're set up to respond to seismic challenges. Seismic challenges means dry hole drilling. That's a polite way of saying dry hole drilling. So why do you have dry hole drilling? Because every method that ever has been, will be, including of course everything we do, have assumptions. You have assumptions, and when the assumptions are satisfied, things work, and when they're not satisfied, you have an issue. That's simple. Among the assumptions that we make in our seismic processing algorithms are that we have adequate acquisition, adequate compute power, and the third is innate algorithmic assumptions and requirements that we can't blame on not having adequate data or adequate compute power. They're just assumptions within the algorithm's derivation that will have are just assumptions beyond those other assumptions. So that how do you address a challenge? If the challenge is due to a violation of an assumption, you can either find a method to satisfy the assumption that you're violated, or find a way to avoid the assumption. One of those two. And one or the other of these is reasonable and indicated but under different circumstances. And we adopt one or the other of these responses to challenges depending on the issue and what we think we can do about it, what difference what we can do about it will make on that problem. So we need to have data. We don't have, even though it's been advertised in the Houston Geophysical Society that we have developed a method to do 3D depth imaging without data. That is not the truth. It was an April Fool's edition. Some people just thought it was an MOSRP report. In fact, they took one element, one event on one trace and generated a 3D depth file. They showed a picture of it. It was very humorous. And they said that even that event wasn't even needed, which was, initial pass at it. So that's not the case. Of course, we need data. There are things that we need and we really need, and there are things that our methods don't need. But what we do is we take ownership and responsibility for the entire processing chain. In other words, no pre-processing step that we can affect, or whether we can affect or not, is not our responsibility. We don't say, well, if we could do better deghosting or better wavelet estimation or better demultiple, then we take responsibility for every link in that chain. And so the program spans the processing chain. So one way to understand the program is to look at the processing chain. There are different processing chains depending on how you view processing. For us, the pre-processing with the dual sensor over-under cable capability, there are Green's theorem methods that you'll hear about for wavelet estimation, including the radiation pattern and source and receiver deghosting. For multiples, ISS, inverse scattering series for free surface and internal multiples, how we're pursuing and have been pursuing and will continue to pursue ISS direct depth imaging without a velocity and nonlinear ABO. We have pioneered direct nonlinear ABO on the inverse scattering series. The mainstream processing chain, meaning what people do in industry, their acquisition is moving towards dual sensor over under cable and beyond. And some of our sponsors, our service company sponsors, are getting involved. That's why it's in gray. They're getting involved in methods that we've developed and pioneered. People like Jim Panzano, people here like Jim Mayen, Zicheng Wang, on Green's theorem methods for providing the prerequisites. And then inverse scattering series for free surface and internal multiples is becoming there's a major oil company that is doing a major service company that is processing data by, in difficult circumstances, by inverse scattering series internal multiples. There was a workshop, SEG workshop, in Lake Tahoe some 2-3 years ago, and on subsalt imaging. And whenever they mentioned multiple removal, there was only one type of multiple removal. There was not radar, it was not decon, it was all surface, free surface multiple removal. That has become and that's an interesting development. When the mainstream processing chain, however, moves to imaging and ABO, it remains velocity-dependent migration and migration inversion, common image gather, tomography, P-wave FWY, model matching ABO. Okay, so those are, so what we're after is a consistent and linked set of processes. All that activity in that processing chain is what I would call a system, the physics of the system. We have equations that describe the physics of the pre-processing and the multiple removal and the imaging, and it's all inside a system. As we know, no physics that we're going to write down is going to deal with the seismic data in the real world. So you have to give a channel for what's outside the system, adaptive. And to ignore that outside the system component is at your peril. And to treat it intelligently is very important. Adaptive energy minimization came along for multiple removal. Verschure, Burkout, Paulo Carvalho, 1994, we worked on energy and published energy minimization, adaptive subtraction. It was needed, it was essential, it was useful. Today, energy minimization, adaptive subtraction is the biggest impediment to progress in removing further multiples. It needs to be replaced. It's like today's reasonable assumption will, without a doubt, I don't care what the assumption is, will be tomorrow's impediment. Okay? That's just the way it goes. In the annual report, I propose an example of a replacement. It's adaptive, but not energy minimization. The adaptive is lined up with the methods it's meant to, it's derived from what's in the system. Okay? rather than impose. What's the problem with adaptive energy minimization? When it works perfectly, it might injure what it's meant to serve. Okay? You don't want a pre-process, the better the pre-process works, than to do harm. In other words, if you have proximal or overlapping multiples, as you can have sometimes in the marine case and often in land, then you try to, you have a destructive interfering primary multiple, and you'll see examples of that here. Then when you take that multiple out, the energy will move up, not down. The criteria is wrong. It's not the method. The criteria of energy minimization fails when the underlying physics has its greatest strength. When you move from stacking to radon to this free surface and internal multiple, you're moving. Stacking was able to get multiples out with a certain move out. Radon, high resolution radon, was able to get a primary from a multiple with closer move out, yes? Separate them. These methods don't care about the move out. In principle, they predict the amplitude and phase of the multiple. So if you can do that, you can surgically remove a multiple interfering with a primary. Now, there are a whole bunch of issues that the adaptive have to deal with, but if you put a criteria on it, which runs at cross purposes with the greatest strength of the method, you need to find a replacement. And Yilo here, we've been talking that in their tests in Saudi Aramco, they're seeing this. There's a statement between us that this adaptive has, not the adaptive has to be replaced, the adaptive energy minimization has to be replaced. Okay? We're going to always need a dial for the outer system. Clear? Okay. Among issues, that's not the only issue. So the meeting itself, the agenda that you have, the report follows the processing chain. So here we go. We're going to talk about the pre-processing and how we use Green's theorem for source signature deghosting, one-way migration, and a new way to do RTM. It's got to go very fast. There's a break, and in other words, pre-processing, multiple removal. I'm not going to go through each one. And then ISS imaging, and then we'll modeling for RTM and ISS imaging. And in other words, we're going to, yes. So it's very important. We tend to be very frank about methods in the geophysical community. When we see a sort of a stampede herd, we're very frank, we've written, and we're going to keep doing that. When you have that kind of attitude, you have to be very frank about what you're doing. So has the inverse scattering series, direct depth imaging without the velocity, met the challenge? No, it hasn't. It has not met the challenge of doing a direct on-field data subsalt image study. Okay? It shows that promise, and there's nothing, and you will argue that tomorrow, what is it about that first field data test that shows it's viable? What's the difference between possible and useful? That's what we have a plan for. If it was clear to us at any moment that it would not be possible, we would shut it down in an instant. We're not in the publishing paper business. It might be difficult, okay? But if we see it's hopeless for some fundamental reason, and we've done that before. Stolt and I in 1980, 82 worked on something for 2 years, and we just concluded it was untenable. It was intractable, okay? What we were trying to do. You stop. You learn things, and you don't keep going. So, yes. Okay. So we're going to give a tutorial, give you some sense of how we do this pre-processing. Green's theorem is very old, 1826, published it, had to pay for it himself, nobody wanted it, okay. George Green. It's been reinvented, it's called by other groups, reciprocity theorem, there's a A.J. DeHoop world-class scientist, has published widely on it. Students of his like Folkman and Vandenberg have followed that. Variants of Green's theorem. It's being reinvented and called interferometry, and it's a Green's theorem. All this virtual source and everything is just Green's second identity. George Green knew that in 1826. Virtual source. And I'm glad this is being recorded. So what we're doing is exploiting an old theory for our purposes. So there are two applications for Green's theorem for us. One is the pre-processing methods of wavelet estimation, deghosting, and source radiation pattern. And those are what we derive from a version of Green's theorem that leads to wave field separation. In Morse-Feshbach and Warner-Wolf, they call it, one or the other place, they call it the extinction theorem. It's Green's theorem. Okay? And so, all those procedures that are listed here require no subsurface information. And hence, they fit with all this ISS, multiple removal, and so on, that also assume no subsurface information. They're consistent. Okay. We're also going to show how Green's theorem can be used for wave field prediction for migration, where subsurface information is required. And it provides a new way to look at RTM without PML. In other words, there's no boundary condition put on the actual wave field. There's boundary conditions put on the Green's function, and in his Green's theorem, those would be onerous if put on the actual wave field in terms of the physics. When you put them on the Green's function, you'll see how that is. They cause no problem to the actual wave field, which is what you care about. Okay, so let's get started. So we're just, Green's theorem, very general, acoustic, elastic, electromagnetic, and so on. We're just exemplifying it in a simple, inhomogeneous acoustic case. So this is an acoustic wave equation in the frequency domain. This is indicates it's heterogeneous. This is some isolated source with some wavelet. We do our typical characterization of the velocity configuration in terms of some reference chosen here to be constant and a perturbation alpha. And with that substitution of equation 2 into 1, you can put the output, you can put the alpha over on the right-hand side, and then these two terms act like a source. This is the source of the energy that starts the wave. This is the source of waves that are different from the reference wave, which are, the source of the scattered wave. The scattered wave being the difference between the reference wave and the actual wave. So this source is here, and then you can write this form 4, where rho has those two pieces. You introduce a Green's function G0 in the reference medium, you can then write the wave field for the actual causal solution here anywhere in space as an integral over the source function times a causal Green's function. It's just linear using superposition and linearity. So that's all space, any point. You integrate over all the sources and you get the field. The only time in math physics that boundary conditions or initial conditions enter a solution is when your description has not included all space and all time. If you start time 0, there are things before time 0 that could influence after time 0. You have to have initial conditions. If it's in all time and all space, nothing's outside. Okay? So Green's second identity is written there. Comes from, derives from history of fundamental theorem of the integral calculus, Gauss's theorem, the Virgin theorem, and so on, and you get to this form. And this form is a mathematical form. It's sort of an identity as valid as the fundamental theorem. So from this form, if you substitute in for del squared p and del squared g0, the differential equation, you get that equation. You get for p, you can solve for p for a point inside a volume now in terms of the integral of the over the sources in the volume plus a surface integral on the surface of that volume. So that's only an expression for the wave field in the volume. That expression, by the way, as it says here, does not require G0 to be causal. It comes from Green's theorem. Green's theorem is not based on causality and linearity of causal solutions. It's an identity. The fact that that equation is valid for any solution, G0, of that differential equation, allows that equation to derive deghosting, wavelength estimation, migration theory, put a G0 minus there, and then you get migration theory. Okay? So, however, if you choose in equation 8, G0 is G0 plus the causal, then it allows you to compare this with the all-space solution that we had a minute ago. This guy. This has to be causal if you want that to be causal. That other expression will produce causal. That's amazing. That will produce a causal P with an anti-causal G0. Okay? When you do migration, you are back propagating, but you're back propagating a causal wave field. It's not some anti-causal process. You're moving back in time on a real wave. Okay? So, what saves that for any G0? Put G0 minus in there. The fact that you have P and grad P from measurements, they nail down that it's causal. If those are measurements of a causal wave field, no matter what choice you make for G0, it will be causal. That's incredible. You can do examples. Is that reasonable to me? No. Is it true? Yes. In other words, it's incredible, okay, that would be true. But after many years of experience with testing and looking at that, you can understand why and how it does that. Anyway, the point here is that we have this expression for P for a point in the volume. We have this for any point R anywhere, including R in the volume. So 9 and 10, 9, which is only true for R in the volume, and 10, which is true anywhere, including in the volume, they are two expressions valid for R in the volume. So for R in the volume, this integral must be that second term. That's the whole business of the extinction theorem. It says, when you have a volume, in other words, Green says, look, we're going to work a compromise, like a businessman. You don't want the field everywhere. You have to give me this, you want it only in this volume, you have to tell me the sources in the volume. But the sources outside the volume, George Green understood, also affect where you say you're interested in the field. Just because you draw a circle in some volume doesn't mean that you drew a math surface. What does that care about the physics? It cares about all the sources. If you say, I only want to know the field inside the volume, it says, you have to give me an integral like this, and then substitute for the sources that are outside, you can replace that with an integral on the surface that picks up the effect of sources outside on the field inside. Okay? That statement gives you wavelength estimation and deghosting. Okay? That simple old idea. There you go. It says you take a surface integral, and you evaluate this surface at a point inside a volume, it gives you the contribution to the sources outside the volume, up to that wave field. Okay, so how do you apply this? Well, first you have to pick a reference medium. In other words, in this world of Green's theorem, the only commitment you have is that the world has to be the world. You break it up into reference and then sources on that reference embedded to make the actual. How you pick the reference will determine what the sources have to be. The only commitment is background plus sources give you actual. So, if you pick, in the marine case, the reference medium to be air and then water all the way down, to turn this into the real world, I have to add air guns and earth, right? Air guns and earth. Those are then the two sources. Clear? In that case. That's where you see two sources. So there you go. You got some source here and now source there. You take this integral, p grad g0, with that g0. In other words, with the g0, what g0? This g0. Green's function for that reference medium. You chose the reference medium. That determines what your sources are. And then that integral with p grad g0 with that g0. Okay? P is not for you to choose. P is what that cable will measure. Yes? G0 you can choose. When you choose G0, that determines what's, you'll see in a second, we pick a different G0 for a different application. And we'll get different sources. This is the choice. Comes from a paper from with Secrets, 1990, for wavelength estimation and source signature. The choice being the reference is air, water, that's its Green's function. And that theorem then says that integral, when evaluated at any point below the cable, will give you the contribution to the total field here due to the source outside that volume, which is the air guns in the reference medium, right? Gives you a source signature, radiation pattern, okay? But that's how it works. Why does Warner-Wolf call this the extinction theorem? Because that integral, that P is the total field due to all the sources. It's the wave field. It is extinguishing. When you evaluate that integral at this point, it extinguishes the portion of the total field here due to the sources in this volume. You just get the portion due to what's outside. That's why they call it extinction theorem. Okay? Some of you know Ross Hill at Chevron Beam. His thesis before he entered oil was involved with extinction theorem, for example. Okay, so that's it. You get a way to calculate P0, the reference wave field, directly in terms of P and grad P. Why is that important? It's important because we need to know the wavelength, and having the source signature and the radiation pattern. If you ignore it, it's at your peril. Jin Long will show you, including the radiation pattern, what difference it makes on removing multiples, free surface and internal. You understand? So you have a way of determining it. In addition, let's say you have your reference wave and your reflection data, and they interfere. Right? Well, what do you usually do? You cut. You will cut right down and lose the large amplitude. This will predict the scattered wave above, meaning your reflection data, and the reference wave below. In other words, it surgically predicts one or the other. It's not filtering, it's not cutting. Okay? No one's used this for that purpose yet. With the acquisition, this is laid dormant for a long time, but now the acquisition that PGS has, GeoStreamer and Western Geco have with dual cables, this has had a rejuvenated interest. The acquisition's there. we didn't have that acquisition in 1990 when that theory first was written. So you'll see examples of the difference that makes. If you have an isotropic source, then P0 reduces to that form, you get a wavelength estimate. And you'll see Lin Tang's work here on our field data, on different ways to estimate the wavelength that we needed for Christmas. You'll see Wiener, you'll see spectral division, and you'll see Green's theorem, okay, on synthetic and field data. What difference does it make? I'm just making random. Okay, so we just, that last was Green's theorem for source signature and radiation pattern. Here's a different application. This application was pioneered by Jingfang Zhang, who's at BP, right here, IN, another star, mechanical Phillips. Here we had a different purpose. We wanted to do deghosting. The reference here is chosen differently than a moment ago. A moment ago, the reference was air and water, right? Here, the reference is water everywhere. Okay? Water. Water from the top of the universe to the bottom, everywhere. Homogeneous water is a reference. If you do that, you have to not just add air guns and earth, you have to add the source that turns water into air. Right? You have a new source. There's a reason we wanted that, because it's a different application. As I said, Green's theorem couldn't care less how you break up the world into background and sources. It just says the combination better be reality. Understand? The separation is up to you into your application. So with this, and this is just an G0 here is the reference medium is homogeneous. So the Green's function in the reference medium, before it was air and water, so the reference Green's function had this and this. Now it's just water, so the reference Green's function just is an outgoing wave in 3D, that outgoing spherical wave. Clear? Okay. So when you have that kind of reference wave, reference Green's function, what if you have a source and the G0 is just leaves that source, it goes out, right? Whatever, in other words, G0D on rho air leaves air. Yes? Leaves. Air guns, leaves air guns. Earth leaves. Well, that directionality is what gives you deghosting. Because if you do if you pick a point here, R, let's say this point R, and you have a, your acquisition is in the water, yes? And you pick this R lower than this air gun. In other words, the output point is that you're choosing in this Green's theorem is below the air gun. Then the three sources, air gun, air, and earth. The air gun's wave that reaches that point is going down. The air wave with that reference Green's function is going down, and the earth, which is 0D, is going up. Well, the earth, then only one of those sources producing an up wave, right, at that receiver. It is the up wave separation is what you want with receiver deghosting. You have down things, up things. If I can determine the up wave in the receiver, I have receiver deghosted. Clear? Hence, this is the only, the rho earth, G0D, is the only up component when you evaluate that integral at that point above the cable but below the source, you will get receiver deghosted data. You need the field and the derivative, okay, to do that. This G0 is different than the G0 a minute ago. this G0 just, the one before for source signature was 2 pieces, right? It had a different reference medium, right? So, that just says that. So this requires for a given source to have dual measurements, key in the derivative or in some other way have that 2 cables. Okay, what about the source side? Source side deghosting. That was where Gene Fang made a major contribution. And there are different ways to arrange that. And I'll give a summary of it. What Xin Fang in his thesis showed is that you can arrange the source side deghosting with a Green's function that vanishes on the cable and on the free surface that only requires a single source. It doesn't require dual source. Okay? Not over-under source. In other words, to do receiver deghosting, you need over-under receivers. Okay? But to do the source side, in principle, you don't need, you use a Green's function like this, which vanishes at two levels. But let me explain some of what we're going to try to do here, not only in this, but in the imaging. The thing that seems the most incredulous is take a complicated thing and give you some simple way to understand it. Okay? So let's, in these 2 slides, I'm going to summarize where we are with deghosting. Okay? Let's say you have up wave and down wave or something here, right? A and B, simple up and down, and deghosting is that. So if you give me the field and the derivative at one level, you know, you give me P of 0, I get A plus B. You get P prime of 0, I, K, A minus B, right? You solve for A and B, and you have this expression. This expression has nothing sensitive in the denominator. Okay? If, however, whoa, there's something. Right. Let's say you don't do that. You don't give A e to the ikz plus B to the minus ikz 2 measurements at one depth. You give it 1 measurement at 2 different depths. Yes? Here and here. So then you get P of 0 is A plus B. P of A is this. You follow? Just substitute. And solve for A and B. In principle, there's no difference. However, in practice, that difference is in this denominator. Okay? If you have perfect depth, then you don't have an issue. If you have notches, right, which we always do, sometimes they matter, sometimes they don't, then the previous slide is preferable to this slide. The previous slide will not have any sensitive denominator. Clear? This can be a 0 when the numerator won't, if you don't get the depth right. Okay? So, in Paulo Carvalho's thesis on free surface multiple, there's a grown-up version of this. That's the first step. Okay? So what's the summary? Well, so whether you, so let me further say, the Green's function, G0dd, that vanishes at the free surface and at the cable, also is a very complicated function, but it basically depends on having information at 2 levels, you follow? Here and here. So it has a denominator reminiscent of that denominator, okay? So the way to remove the need for double sources, in other words, if you want to be, if you have any kind of acquisition at your disposal, then this way, which was, I don't know, written down, 2002, we published a paper with a combination of first doing receiver deghosting and then source deghosting. This is before Xingfang. This says to do that, you need over on the receivers and then over on the sources. If you do that, if you have that available, that will lead on the source side to a stability in the presence of notches that you will not get if you use that G0DD and you only use a single source. Is that clear? So, when does it matter? If you have total streamer data and your notch comes in 125 hertz, so 6 meters, 9 meters below the free surface, and your data is 100 hertz or less, then that source notch doesn't matter. Then one source will be adequate. You don't ever deal with that instability. If you collect 250 hertz data, which is not normal, but it's sometimes there, then that notch matters. In addition, the location of the notch depends on the depth of the source and receiver. If you go down to the ocean bottom, then the notch will come in sooner. And, okay, the notches will come in sooner, and their removal becomes more serious, and then over on the sources as well as over on the receivers will probably be indicated for the stability of dealing with the notch. Clear? That's the summary. Okay. This is Green's theorem for migration now. We're covering the world of Green's theorem. The first Green's theorem paper in geophysics, Schneider, February 1978. They considered infinite volume. The idea was to use surface measurements and knowledge of the medium to predict the wave field in the medium. What are we talking about now? We're going to propose a candidate method to replace RTM with PML. Yeah, that's what the topic is about. So we're just going to review how Green's theorem. So there are issues with that model. That model, if you chose G0 plus in it, would have everything known to forever. There'd be no source of scattered wave, and that's not a good thing. If you use anti-causal Green's function, it does not vanish at large distance. Okay? Sommerfeld does not. So you have an issue. What happened was there was a replacement of that model with this model. I'm not sure who first wrote it. Certainly Stolt and I wrote about this in 1990. Okay? A replacement of the full known volume with something known, something unknown. And the Green's theorem volume is going to have an upper and lower surface. So the imaging, in fact, is going to be the onset. You're only going to need to know what the medium is to the onset of the reflector, yes? So people say you need to know migration theory, conventional migration is inconsistent because you have to know everything to do anything. That's not, you don't need to know everything. You just need to know enough to get to the reflector, yeah? So it allows for unknown. So the issue here, though, so this gets away from the issues of the infinite volume of known. But the issue was that if you have a surface integral that you're trying to predict the wave in the volume from surface measurements, you don't have measurements at the lower surface. Yeah? So that was dealt with. That if you can show analytically that if you have a wave that's moving up through that volume that you want to predict, an up wave, meaning you have a downward continuation from your source down to a reflector, then there's an up propagating wave from your reflector to your receiver that you're trying to send back to image. Yes? So the early views of migration was one way down, one way up, right? So if you can show analytically that if the wave is moving up, and if you choose an anti-causal Green's function on that surface, then the lower surface will not contribute. You can show that with a pencil. We've done that in class 100 times, okay? So that drives why we use anti-causal in Green's theorem. So what's the idea? Anti-causal says, in other words, you could use G0 plus if you want, but then you're going to have measurements in the earth, because what anti-causal does is this wave moves up, you measure it. The anti-causal Green's function on that surface integral says, I'll tell you what it was from what it is now, where it was from what it is now. If you use G0 plus, you will need the bottom and not the top. It'll predict forward in time. You know, where from these measurements, what the wave will have been. So, okay? So that's, in addition, so you don't need measurements on the bottom. In addition, we know that you don't need the field and the derivative on top. It's a one-way wave. A e to the ikz, b to the minus ikz. So you used to say one-way wave, you drop one of them, right? And then you just shift. That's slope migration. So how does Green's theorem arrange that? You have the surface integral with p grad g0 minus the other way around on the upper surface. If you must, what they call, choose a Dirichlet condition on that anti-causal Green's function, yes? And that condition on the anti-causal Green's function will wipe out the need for the normal derivative. Okay. So, consider a simple example. A wave moves up, okay? And this is the volume, A and B. And now, in other words, it's 1D, so you just have Green's theorem is just an evaluation at 2 levels. And here you have that Green's theorem, equation 14. Here's the Green's function in that medium. Choose the anti-causal Green's function like this. And you can show that the lower surface, B, doesn't contribute, and A does. Okay? A contributes here, and B doesn't. The important point here is after we're convinced that the lower surface doesn't contribute for any anti-causal, we impose a condition on the anti-causal that it vanish on the upper surface, so we don't need the normal derivative. Okay? When you do that, that's how you do that, with an image across like that. That expression is the Dirichlet. When you take the derivative of that guy and multiply it by the field, as you would in Green's theorem, you get slope migration, a shift. In other words, why am I saying this? First, it shows that some statement, but it's a more important point. You put a condition on the Green's function that it vanish on the cable. Yes? That's as the Green's function. If you think physically, what do you mean vanish? It's like a free surface on the cable for the Green's function. Yes? If you said that to the actual field, you'd be insane, right? What do you mean putting the real field having a zero boundary condition on the cable? But you do that for the Green's function to not have it requiring an input of a derivative, okay? It made no difference that the fact that that Green's function vanished on the cable made no difference in predicting P. There's clearly a reason. I'm saying this because we're about to go to RTM, yes? Here. So everybody understands that point, yes? So the fact that Dirichlet boundary condition was imposed on the Green's function had no similar effect on the predicted wave field. It's just a way to get rid of the need for a normal derivative. Okay, now we want RTM. So remember, the not needing the bottom of that surface to predict the field inside that volume was arranged by having an assumption of an upgoing wave. For an upgoing wave in that volume that you were back propagating, an anti-causal Green's function had no contribution from the lower surface, okay? But if you have a wave that's not one wave propagating in that medium, as an RTM, that's not the case. You can put you take some two-way wave and put an anti-causal or causal or some linear combination, it will not predict, okay? You have to, what we arranged is a paper with Bob Stokes and Jim Mahan, 2 papers which go into examples and so on what's going on here. But what you have to do is you have to go back to this. This is for simple homogeneous. You have to numerically do for inhomogeneous, but it gives you the idea. The general solution to an inhomogeneous differential equation is the general solution to the homogeneous and any particular solution to the inhomogeneous. So, for example, that's 1D normal instance kind of thing, and you have 2 values, A and B, to choose. For RTM, we don't want any contribution on the bottom. Yes? We want just field and the derivative on top. You're going to need field and the derivative for you cannot get rid of it. It's a 2, but it's deghosted. Okay? We're going to deghost before we migrate. So it's an up wave at the receiver, and at the receiver it's one way, and making its derivative is not a big deal once you deghost it. And that's one of our pre-processing steps. But the point is, you got to get rid of that bottom surface. So we impose that the field and the derivative both vanish at the bottom. Make them both go. That sounds weird. It doesn't sound like Morse and Feshbach. Morse and Feshbach say Dirichlet, Neumann, Robin, everywhere. What we're saying is you can give me Dirichlet and Neumann on one piece and nothing on the bottom. You do that all the time with 2-way, right? We did a minute ago when we gave you 2 values at one place rather than, right? So when you do that, it's simpler to arrange a wave field to vanish and its derivative to vanish than the complexity of dealing with PML, which is having to put in a medium, some kind of fictitious absorptive media that will make no reflections at any angle. It gets complicated when you deal with anisotropic elastic media. And we've seen examples from a sponsor, from a service company sponsor, expert at RTM and PML, where with their best effort, there were artifacts from PML in the image space. And so that was shown to us in confidence to encourage us that it isn't a done deal, the PML issue. So D. Chang is one among others, Wilbur Herrera, looking at issues. First of all, we need to know in detail what is done today. What is PML, right? In detail, what is finite difference with PML? So what is the cost that it will take between that and what we're proposing? How much will it cost? That's a toy, homogeneous. We're talking about an inhomogeneous Earth. So there's been discussion with Tom McClure and Michael Perot at IBM to do comparisons, run times. They have facility, and Scott Moore and we've talked, yes, about looking at that as well. So that's an example of where we're trying to, where did this come from? This came from us looking at prerequisites, and we see, well, how would you do migration? Okay? And there's no harm if we can help something conventional. So this is a summary. Means theorem for migration. For on our processing, the prerequisites, one of the important advantages of the Green's theorem form, please listen to this, for deghosting, for example, compared to other methods for deghosting. What Green's theorem gives you is a surface integral over the field and the derivative. It does not say that integral has to be straight. It's a surface integral. Okay? If you have a corrugated, complicated ocean bottom and you want to do deghosting, just integrate on it. If you're doing something where the first step is Fourier transform, you're going to have a problem with acquisition like that. Okay? So that's a contribution from Jean-Paul Zhang, who's now a DP. And then the second separate is the RTM work we just discussed. That is a method that will assume that you know the velocity. Okay? This RTM business, yes? The Green's function that you have to calculate, that vanishes and its derivative vanishes on the boundary, is going to be for a heterogeneous medium that we will assume, as conventional migration does, that we know. Yes?
Implementation-wise, for the second item, like say if one-way wave equation, we do downward calculation. Now if two-way without the PML, how can we imagine how to implement that? Assume you find that A and B properly.
Right. Well,
what is the implementation kind of
right.
Yeah.
The easy answer is in the papers we published on that. We show examples of how you implement and how it predicts in media where the wave is two-way. How it, in other words, you give it the medium. So the Green's function is working with the actual medium. Just put that Green's function such that it and its derivative vanishes on the bottom in Green's theorem with surface measurements, and it predicts the wave field. It doesn't care whether it does this or not. It just predicts the wave field in this discontinuous heterogeneous medium without having to impose conditions on the actual wave field. Okay? In other words, if you put on the actual wave field that it and its derivative vanish, that's a very weird thing. You understand? We don't care, like you saw in the Stolt migration, what you do to the Green's function. It's the field preserving its physics that we care about. The Green's function is an auxiliary function chosen for convenience with boundary conditions at our convenience. As long as you never violate that you're actually getting the wave field in two-way sense. Why? How will it know to be two-way? Because the Green's function is in a medium which makes two-way. Okay? The medium makes it two-way. You understand? You have.
Maybe I ask you say example. My data is at z equals 0 at the surface. So I want the wave field at 200 meters in depth. All the way I go from 0 to 200. But now I cannot do it because it's two-way. So from 0, how do I go? How do I go to 10 kilometers first and then go from 10 kilometers to 200? I do that way?
Well, you would have to find the Green's function in your actual medium.
Okay.
All we're doing is, in that case, we're not needing a boundary condition, okay, on the field. So, for example, you do, let's say, RTM with finite difference. Run backwards. There are boundary conditions of finite difference. Those conditions can cause issues, yes, in the volume. We're saying for the Green's function, those conditions that would cause in the Green's function world, in the volume, we couldn't care less. In other words, going back to the business where we put a Dirichlet on the cable, we would never do that for the actual field, but putting it on for the Green's function is just a convenient thing to get rid of the need for the normal derivative. Here we want to get rid of the need for the field and the derivative on a surface so that we don't have any contribution from it. There's no other medium down there, it's just no contribution from it. You integrate like this, and on this lower surface, nothing contributes. Because the green function and its derivative, which are part of that integral, are made to vanish there.
But this green function, like a previous green function, we only need the information between 0 depth and 200 meter. We only need the information in between. Now we will need the information below 200, that green function, right? Because physics tells us we need something below 200 in order to make that green function, if it is two-way.
No, if, let's say you want to go to 200.
Yes.
I'd make my closed surface just under it.
Yes.
Okay? Let's say 200 was your goal.
Yeah.
I will make a surface integral that allows me to predict where you're interested in, but that surface integral will have no contribution to that field at 200 from the lower boundary. It'll all be just from the top. Okay? So you don't have to go deeper. If that's your aim, make that lower surface right below where you're interested in. If we had to go deeper, that would be a downside. You don't. Okay? You just, if you know where your target region is, just make that lower surface right below it.
That part, how do you calculate the reduction?
How do you, well, in analytics. Oh, no. Well, you could. In fact, in other words, but we're looking at, let me give you the example. Let's say you do, that's the whole point. We would never do that. Well, thank you. Because if we did, we'd be going around in a circle. The point is, looking at the history of finite difference, as D will show very clearly, as soon as you write finite difference, you have an interest volume, and you must say something about the last point inside your interest. Because depending on the order, you know, fourth order, second order, there's something you have to do. So usually, the first thing they did is they said zeros, right? Zeros, Dirichlet. That's a problem for the real wave field. They didn't like that, so they found ways, Bob Keyes, Al Reynolds, and PML, to make it not reflect. They didn't want things coming back. One way is make your volume huge, so you don't care what comes back. But when you start dealing with seem huge models to begin with, it's hard to make the model 3 times bigger, not to care. It's so costly. So, to your excellent question, let's say all it took was making the field vanish. Forget about the derivative for a second. Then how we would make the Green's function is run a finite difference in your medium, yes, heterogeneous medium, where you let Dirichlet be in. You let the Dirichlet condition. On that Green's function, it will bounce. Not good. On that wave field, it won't. Okay? That Green's function is going into Green's theorem. Okay? And Green's theorem is just going to say that surface didn't contribute. Because G, okay, and the derivative, in other words, conditions on the Green's function that would be onerous on the actual wave field are harmless on the Green's function. And you do that at convenience.
So you're saying the green theorem will automatically destroy the boundary from the green function?
The Green's theorem will destroy, there will be no contribution from it.
So you're thinking about green theorem like the rigid condition, which only keep the good part, remove the bad part. That's what you're trying to do.
Well, Green's theorem puts the actual field you're interested in and some auxiliary field, called the Green's function in this. And the Green's function is chosen for your convenience. In other words, so let's say there's a surface integral, P grad G, G grad P, here to get this. Let's say I don't have this measurement here. If I do finite difference to actual field, I got to say something about the actual field. Dirichlet, PML, something, yes, to be able to run it. each of those have issues, okay? Dirichlet will produce a bounce. What I'm saying is, if you look at the problem as not a finite difference method for the field, but a finite difference method for the Green's function that's going to go into Green's theorem, then all that's doing is you have a surface integral with P and G0, let's say, or P and G in that case, and you put conditions on the Green's function that make it on certain surfaces give no contribution to your calculation. Okay? Those, what do you do to the actual wave field? Nothing. Nothing. So you put conditions on the Green's function, which would be some nightmare if you did it on the actual wave field. It does no harm. Please, easiest way is to think about that Stoke migration formula, right? We put that condition, in other words, just to remind what happened here. We had an up wave, right? Up wave, A e to the I k z or something. And so it was one way. The lowest surface gives you no contribution if you pick G0 minus. In addition, we knew for a wave that we've said is one way, that you don't need two conditions to figure out what it was. P of 0, e to the minus ikz will tell you where it was, right? So that extra term, which has the derivative of P on the upper surface, is not needed. Well, how are you going to arrange Green's theorem to do that? Oh, make the Green's function at the upper surface vanish. Okay? Well, when you do that, that Green's function, if you look at it, is a bounce. But it has no effect on the field.
There's one problem. So when with half going away, we don't need PML. We don't need the boundary because half
Right.
going away.
I agree. This was just to give you some idea that when you put conditions on the Green's function, is not the same as putting the conditions on the actual wave field. Our interest in PML is to produce from surface measurements what the actual wave field is in the medium, where it can go through two-way propagation in the medium without putting conditions on the actual wave field, as directly doing that by finite difference would have consequences either in arranging the PML or in, if you use some kind of Dirichlet, in terms of what it would send back in. But we can continue discussing. So, is this something where we're saying, stop what you do now? No. We need to do comparisons. What does it cost? What does it cost to arrange that Green's function, yes, with the field and derivative to vanish? And what is the benefit versus the cost? Yes? We haven't looked at that. Okay? So this is a thought, yes, with simple examples of how it would work. The real deal is, how does it work when you are doing this numerically? You know, finite differencing for the Green's function, right? Everybody understands? So I think the meeting's over. No. Well, we'll see you next year. So I think we're done. This is some references to the RTM. These papers we're glad to send you go into detail of this. And this is Bill Schneider's. Ooh, okay. So I think we're ready for a break.